From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It's a great honor, of course, to be asked to inaugurate this series, and I join in the thanks to Molly and Fred Kellogg for making it possible. Being in this building is also an enormous treat to me. I've never been here before. To have so many people come in the middle of a sunny afternoon to hear me is also quite remarkable. It all puts me in mind of a conversation I had with that same learned hand Fred described. One day he said to me, across the two desks which were joined together, "Do you ever think about heaven?" "No," I said, "not much." He said, "Well, I do. Would you like me to tell you what heaven is like?" I said, "Yes, I'd be eternally grateful." He ignored that. And he said, "I'll tell you, a day in heaven begins with a polo match. Hand is the captain of the heavenly host, and he scores goal after goal under thunderous heat, and the stands ring with his name, "Go Hand." And then there's lunch. Before lunch, martinis. And the conversation at lunch was wonderful, as you would expect, given who was there. After lunch, a football game, American football. Hand is the quarterback for the good side. He passes, he sneaks, he engineers an amazing victory, and the stands ring with his name, "Go Hand." And then comes dinner, and the martinis are much drier at dinner. And then dinner. If you thought the talk at lunch was good, you ought to have been at dinner. Epigram followed epigram in a crescendo of wit and elegance, until suddenly a voice was heard to cry out, "Shut up, Voltaire, I want to hear what Hand is saying." My subject today is interpretation. My question, is there truth to be had in interpretation? You're all familiar with the controversies that we, our lawyers, our professors, our judges, our justices, have about interpretation. Some of them are very grand. Does the Second Amendment, properly interpreted, give us as individuals the right to have firearms? Does the Second Amendment apply to the states? Does the First Amendment apply to corporations and protect them when they make Hillary the movie? Some of the questions are much less grand. They're questions about the right interpretation of the Uniform Commercial Code or precedents governing the law of negotiable instruments. We disagree at every level, and we are, as a profession and individually, one by one, ambivalent about that disagreement. Is there truth to be had? Are we contesting what the truth is? That is certainly, to use a grand phrase, the phenomenology of most lawyers. We read, we puzzle again, then we come to a judgment, and it's a judgment, not a choice. It doesn't feel like a preference. It feels like a judgment about what the truth is. Imagine a judge who's just sentenced a villain to jail, or perhaps worse, and then says at the end of his opinion, of course, that's the way I see it. That's my opinion. That's the way I read it. But there are other interpretations, and they're equally good. We would want that judge sent to jail. And yet, when we stand back and look at the character of the disagreement, it seems odd to say there's truth to be had. Why? Because the disagreements in interpretation are intractable, pervasive, and endless. We divide into tribes, originalists, moral, readers, and the rest. We divide into these tribes, and no tribe has much to say that's going to influence, let alone convince the other side. The disagreement simply continues. Indeed, this can be a personal situation. A judge may write an opinion that feels right to him that day, but he might discard it in favor of a different one that feels right to him another day. There's not much he can say except, I see it differently. And that doesn't seem to sort well with truth. It's that ambivalence which is my subject this afternoon. How can we resolve it? I want to approach that question, however, by making it a bigger question. Law is only one area in which we interpret. Interpretation is a general, pervasive feature. It's a department of human reason. And I want to ask, is there truth in interpretation in general? We interpret in many different ways and occasions. You, I hope, are interpreting me right now as I speak. You're trying to decide what it is that I mean to say. Sociologists interpret cultures and institutions. Historians interpret ages, events, and epochs. Literary and artistic critics interpret poems, plays, and paintings. Priests and rabbis interpret sacred text. Psychoanalysts interpret your dreams. And in all of these different genres, as I'll call them, of interpretation, there are different separate houses. Lawyers interpret wills, contracts, constitutions, and statutes, and they debate among themselves whether the same approach is appropriate for each. Literary and artistic critics debate such apparently disparate questions as the importance of moral value in discerning the meaning of a poem. Whether Piero della Francesca's great painting, The Risen Christ, in San Sepolcro, really is a Christian painting, or whether, as some eminent critics claim, it's a pagan painting. Did Lady Macbeth have a lover before she married Glamis? Now, in all of these, as to all of these questions, the same ambivalence arises. On the one hand, the phenomenology of criticism, what it feels like to do it, is objective, supposing there's truth to be had and the interpreter seeks the truth. On the other hand, the nature of the disagreement is such that it seems odd, indeed hubristic, to suppose that there is any such truth. The phenomenology, it seems to me, clear. Imagine a scholar who spends his entire life writing a tome, 1,200 pages on Hamlet, and then the last page says, well, there it is. That's how I see it. Of course, there are many other opinions equally good as mine. Wouldn't that be crazy? Two of the most eminent critics of the last century put the matter, the case for objectivity, this way. F.R. Leavis, a great critic at Cambridge, said, "A real critical judgment of its very nature always means to be more than merely personal. Essentially, a critical judgment has the form, 'This is so, isn't it?'" And his American counterpart, the, I think, founder of the New Criticism movement, Clarence Brooks, said this, "I suppose that the practicing critic can never be too often reminded of the gap between his reading and the true reading of the poem. The alternatives are desperate. Either we say that one person's reading is as good as another's, or else we take the lowest common denominator of the various readings that have been made." That is how it feels to the critic, knowing that they disagree, as Leavis and Brooks in fact did. And yet again, the disagreements are intractable and pervasive, just as we have tribes of legal interpreters, so we have tribes of literary interpreters, the new critics, the author's intention school, the structuralist, the post-structuralist, the deconstructuralist, every post and every de, everything you can think of. They're all in the field. They talk to each other. They do not convince. They do not budge. And on they go as separate tribes. So no wonder the skeptical view, the view that says Leavis and Brooks are deceiving themselves. There is no right answer. There are only different answers to questions of interpretation across all the genres I mentioned. No wonder that view is appealing. But it's now time for me to suggest to you that the skeptical view, though appealing for all the reasons I've suggested, is in fact incoherent. It's self-contradictory. Why? Imagine those two critics, Leavis and Brooks, both very eminent. They disagreed about the correct reading of many poems, including Yeats's wonderful Among School Children. Many of you will know that poem. It's the one that ends, "But who can tell the dancer from the dance?" Leavis, who didn't in general admire Yeats, adored that poem because he said it contains morally irresistible truth. Brooks completely disagreed. He said it's a poem about the metaphysical boundary between the natural and the supernatural. We might come back to that later on. But now imagine a third critic who arrives on this scene and says, "You're both wrong. You're making the mistake of thinking there's one true reading and the others are just mistakes. You're both wrong. There is no such truth." Now I ask you, what could make the third critic's opinion right? It can't be made right by metaphysics, can't be made right by science, it can't be made right by sociology. The third opinion, the no right answer opinion, is itself an interpretation. It's an interpretation of among school children. It needs an argument. It suffers from exactly the same difficulties as the first two interpretations. It can't convince anyone. It's ephemeral. It's not demonstrable. If these characteristics count against Brooks and count against Leibniz, they count against the skeptic as well. But the skeptic says there is no truth in interpretation, and he contradicts himself because he must claim truth for his own interpretation. This point, which I believe to be very important, is often obscured because we fail to make a necessary distinction between two phenomena, uncertainty and skepticism. People often treat skepticism as the default position. If no positive position, Leibniz or Brooks, is convincing, if there are any number of positions and none of them is convincing, then the skeptic must be right. There is no right answer. But the true default is uncertainty. That's what you're entitled to claim if nothing persuades you. To claim more, to claim skepticism, is to make an independent interpretation which puts you out on the limb of truth as firmly as any positive interpretation does. So, appealing though it is, popular though it is, I think we must set interpretive skepticism aside, skepticism of a grand kind. We must set it aside. But that isolates the question. If there is truth in spite of all this intractable disagreement, where can that truth lie? What can make an interpretation true? There is a very popular answer to that question. It's popular in law. It's popular in many other places. That's the psychological state answer. An interpretation is an attempt to retrieve from history the intention of some author or creator. Did Jessica, Shylock's daughter, hate her father because she was ashamed of her Jewishness? That simply asks, on the psychological state view, was that what Shakespeare intended in writing her lines in the play? Now, the appeal of the psychological state theory is irresistible in some genres of interpretation. Conversation, for example, as I said, I hope you're interpreting me as I speak. But that means you're trying to capture a psychological state. That is, what I am trying to say to you, what I hope you will understand. That's my psychological state. The psychological state theory is ridiculous in some other genres. People who write, historians who write about the meaning of the French Revolution are not trying to find out what was in the mind of the Jacobins as they rioted and killed. It's ineligible. I believe, popular as it is, that the psychological state theory is actually ridiculous in law. What did the congressman who voted for a statute intend? He intended to get reelected and to please his contributors. And that has nothing to do with how we read the statute. In the middle, in literary and artistic interpretation, the author's intention theory, as it's called, has waxed and waned, flourished and disappeared. In the 19th century, the age of Romanticism, it was very popular. By the end of the 20th, after the new critics arrived, it was deemed not eligible. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, in a very nice phrase, said, "The author is only the first reader, nothing more." Tom Stoppard, playwright, had what I think a wonderful image. He said the relation between the playwright and the interpreter is like the relation between the passenger and the customs inspector. Custom inspector finds things in the suitcase that the passenger has to agree are there, but knows he didn't pack. And that, in Stoppard's image, captures the relationship between the creator who creates something and the critic who finds something in it that the author had not only no intention to put there, but was ignorant until he learned was there. So the psychological state theory is not eligible for the role that I seek. I would like to find a general theory of interpretation that holds across these genres of interpretation, and the psychological state theory is not that. But its popularity does present a challenge to anyone composing a general theory. A general theory must explain why it is that the psychological state theory is irresistible in some genre, not eligible in other genre, and controversial in the middle. Now, you might ask, what is this? I'm clearly building up to an attempt to describe a general theory that fits all the genre, meets that conditions and the others that we might want to impose. I'm going to describe this general theory. I'll call it the responsibility theory of interpretation. And I'm going to describe it in a skeleton way first, perhaps cryptic way, and then try and flesh it out with some examples. We begin with the recognition that interpretation is a collective activity. We can interpret statutes or sacred texts or paintings because others have done that in the past. We join a tradition, and as we interpret objects, so we interpret the tradition that we have joined. T.S. Eliot said once that a poet interprets the history of poetry as he creates a new poem. And I'm making the same claim, which I'll try and illustrate in a moment, on behalf of interpretation. Second, interpreters, those who have joined and continue this tradition or practice of interpretation, suppose that the practice has some point. It's not an idle exercise. It embodies some value, and it embodies an interpretive responsibility that flows from that value. And people who join an uninterpretive tradition agree generally about the purpose that it serves, but agree only at a very high level of abstraction. Lawyers interpreting documents and constitutions might agree that the aim is somehow to serve justice. Critics might agree that the aim of artistic or literary criticism is to identify and make available, or, when appropriate, to deny artistic excellence. Yes, we can agree, but as soon as we make the description even somewhat less abstract, then we fall into disagreement. Consider two American lawyers disagreeing about the right way to interpret the Constitution. They disagree about the nature of constitutional law. Why? Probably because they disagree about the best conception of democracy. They begin with the idea that there is a division of power and authority between interpreters and original creators, but they disagree because they disagree about the best interpretation of democracy, about where that balance of power lies, what the responsibility of the judge is. They disagree about democracy perhaps because they disagree about the more basic principles of legitimacy. They might disagree about legitimacy because they disagree about dignity, independence, and a vast array of other values. I'm not, of course, suggesting that this tree structure of principle branching out with 1,000 points of potential disagreement is visible to the interpreters. No, their interpretive approach, to fall back on an overused metaphor, is the tip of the iceberg. It's what is available self-consciously that they identify as making them members of some tribe. But the great ice mass that lies below the surface of consciousness, formed by instinct, training, and experience, unavailable to them, is nevertheless there, exercising its influence, giving the interpreter a sense that there is truth to be had, and obscuring from him the true basis of his claim, the true basis of the controversy. I'm suggesting, with that illustration, with others I hope to offer you, I'm suggesting that we think of truth in interpretation in the following way. The true interpretation of some object, a poem, a painting, a provision of the Constitution, is the reading of that which best acquits the responsibility of interpreters given by the best interpretation of the practice they have joined. Interpretation is multiply interpretive. It's interpretive all the way down. Now, one thing, this picture of interpretation as interpretive responsibility rising out of a deeper interpretation. One advantage of this is that it serves what I believe to be a useful way to distinguish families of interpretive genre. And to be very quick about it, these families can be distinguished in the following way, among no doubt others. First, we distinguish collaborative interpretation. This is the set of interpretive genres in which the interpreter properly takes himself or herself to be in partnership with someone who came before and created the object of interpretation. The musician playing a sonata is in partnership with the composer. The critic studying a play is in partnership with the playwright. The judge is in partnership with someone who he identifies as having made the law that he interprets. I distinguish collaborative from explanatory interpretation. Explanatory interpretation includes history. The historian of the Holocaust does not take himself to be a partner of the Nazis in any respect. Explanatory interpretation studies history, not the details of history, not what happened when, but the meaning of historical events and epochs, by drawing from the raw data what he takes to be important and to provide an important lesson for his audience. There's a third family of interpretation, which I would call conceptual interpretation. I won't say any more about it this afternoon, except to note that in my view, all of philosophy is conceptual interpretation of concepts that we share. Our main subject is collaborative interpretation, because law belongs to collaborative interpretation, like conversation and like literary interpretation. But I'll talk first about literary interpretation. I want to suggest to you that we best understand disagreements between or among critics by tracing out the underground or assumed and sometimes quite self-conscious attitude of the critic to the apparently different question, where does the value of literature lie? I'm suggesting that this view of interpretation erodes the difference that seems natural between two questions. What makes a poem good, and what does this particular poem mean? I'm going to read you something from a recent compendious, that's an understatement, anthology of about 1,600 pages of literary criticism. And in the introduction, by the four compilers of this anthology, we find this: theories of literature and theories of reading have affinities with one another. Here are four instances. First, the formalist idea of literature as a well-made artistic object corresponds to the notion of reading as careful explication and evaluation of dense poetic style. Second, when viewed as the spiritual expression of a gifted seer, poetry elicits a biographical approach to criticism focused on the poet's inner development. Third, dense historical symbolic works presuppose a theory of reading as exegesis or decipherment. Fourth, literature conceived as social text or discourse calls for cultural critique. While we can separate theories of literature from theories of interpretation, they often work hand in hand. I don't ask you to agree with the four-part analysis offered in this introduction to that massive compilation, but I ask you to consider the underlying hypothesis, which is that in order to understand why an interpreter interprets as he does, we have to understand what his theory is of excellence in the object he interprets, and therefore his sense of what his responsibility is. I mentioned Yeats's Among School Children, a 60-year-old smiling public man visits a schoolroom and is attracted by a particular schoolgirl bending over her desk. Yeats's most eminent biographer, Roy Foster, notes that 3 days before he wrote this poem, Yeats visited a Catholic school, St. Otteran's in Ireland, and that he often referred to his visit as a senator in the Irish Senate when discussing educational reform in Ireland. Foster also tells us that the Lydian figure, as Yeats called her, of the little schoolgirl, was actually Maud Gonne, Yeats's long ago lover, now like himself, hollow of cheek. So Foster reads this as a critique of public education and reads the particular reference to this mythological figure as a reference to his now elderly, once beautiful lover. I mentioned this in that detail because decades earlier, Cleanth Brooks, whom I mentioned before, warned us exactly against this interpretation. Died before Foster was born, probably. He warned us against it. He said, it would be a terrible mistake to read this poem as a political comment. And of course, he said, it would be an even worse mistake to identify the Lydian figure with Maud Gonne, an identification to which biographers are particularly and erroneously drawn. Now, how shall we understand this? We might say, well, Brooks is offering an account of the poem as a piece of literature, and Foster is explaining how the poem came to be written in the way that it did. Difference between interpretation, collaborative, and explanation, like history. I don't think that will work. Brooks looked forward to this interpretation he disliked as a mistake. And Foster offers it as a reading of the poem, not as a piece itself of biography. Now, in order to understand this disagreement, in order to see how these two critics disagreed with one another rather than simply complimented each other, we have to attend to their theories of what is great in literature. Brooks, as I said, a new critic, held that a poem has its deep value as an expression of an idea which has to be contained within the poem itself. It has to be there in the poem, independent of any information we can bring to it about the poet or the moment in which he lived. It must resist, he emphasized, paraphrase. It must be something that can only be said in a poem that couldn't be put any other way, giving us a sense, as he thought of this particular poem, giving us a sense of deep metaphysical truth. He thought this was a Platonic exercise, this poem, halfway to the great Byzantium poems that Yeats wrote later. So here you have two critics whose work, I think, can only be understood in that way. Now I'm going to read you a passage from another famous poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, writing at the height of the Romantic movement, explaining why interpretation must be the recovery of the genius of the poet, the psychological state theory. Here's Coleridge. What is poetry? Is so nearly the same question with what is a poet, that the answer to the one is involved in the solution of the other. For it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthesis and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. Well, you can see from that immediately the spirit, the ground of the author's intention school of criticism, which flourished in the Romantic period. We retrieve the genius of the poet, which fuses itself into the right understanding of the poem. Contrast that with the image created, as I told you, by Tom Stoppard. Here's another illustration. I think even more dramatic. The 18th century French painter Antoine Watteau painted, as most of you will be familiar with his work, scenes that on the surface are scenes of frivolity, gaiety. And so he was regarded by his 18th century contemporary interpreters who celebrated the joyous freedom and almost effeminate lightness of his paintings. A relief after the sour days of Louis the Sun King that had come to an end. By the more sober 19th century, the critics' opinion of Watteau had gone 180 degrees in the other direction. Watteau was regarded as melancholy, tragic, a painter of isolation, despair. Recently, I read in the New York Review of Books another comment on Watteau. The critic, according to this writer, wants to steep Watteau's paintings in the world he, the critic, contemporarily inhabits, and vice versa. Watteau's own moment of novelty gets overlaid with the many versions of the modern that ensued. The painting of the Pierrot Gilles taps into the revival of mime theater in 1830s Paris, and the resuscitation of that revival in Marcel Carné's great film of 1945, Les Enfants de Paradis. Not to mention Cézanne's pictorial dalliance with Perrault figures in the 1880s and Picasso's after the Great War. And these give us a larger sense of what Watteau was up to. Gilles suggests one of his paintings, Gilles suggests a characteristic modernist anxiety. Now look what has happened. This kaleidoscope of different interpretations of the painters has come to an interpretation that reads Watteau through the lens of Cézanne and Picasso and Les Enfants de Paradis, all of which. It isn't that the critic has discovered something new about the life of Watteau or his times or what was in his mind. It isn't as if one critic has seen something in the picture that others have missed. Rather, what different critics see in the picture and why is itself a subject for interpretation. And I think it can only be understood against the background of something like the responsibility theory that I'm urging upon you. That is, what has happened is that from the 18th to the 19th century, from the frivolity to the sober, and then into the 20th and 21st century, which is preoccupied with the notion of literature as an expression of the modernist. Those changes, in a sense, of what would make the poem great have been reflected, or the painting, what would make the painting great, have been reflected in distinct senses of what the painting is. Now, very briefly, I want to say a bit about history, because history is an example of a different family of interpretive genres, the explanatory family. The great 19th century pride of British history was Macaulay. Macaulay, in the first paragraph, one of his famous books, writes as follows. Please forgive the hubris. The history of our country during the last 160 years is eminently the history of physical, of moral, and of intellectual development. This view of what the history of Britain in the last 100 years should be seen to embody angered Herbert Butterfield, who wrote a book called The Whig Theory of History and took Macaulay to be the arch-Whig. The Whig historian, Butterfield wrote, can say that events take on their due proportion when observed through the lapse of time. He can say that events must be judged by their ultimate issues, which, since we can trace them no farther, we must at least follow down to the present. He can say that it is only in relation to the 20th century that one happening or another in the past has relevance or significance for us. It is easy to see the fight between Christianity and paganism as a play of forces and discuss it, so to speak, in the abstract with one eye on our situation, but it is much more illuminating to watch it as the interplay of personalities and people. Much more interesting if we can take the general statement with which we began and pursue it in its concrete incidents till we discover into what manifold detail it differentiates itself. It is along this line that the historian carries us truly and carries us away from the world of general ideas. Of course, a Marxist historian writes very differently, and a historian who thinks climate is the greatest influence on human events writes still differently yet. And we cannot, I think, understand the different interpretive styles that historians bring to the interpretive part of their craft, not just what happened when, but what meaning we should take from it. We cannot understand that without understanding the more basic, deep sense of what is important for us now in what happened to them then. I return, though I promise only briefly, to the subject with which I began, which is law. To repeat, the general lesson I hope to take from all of this rumination is a responsibility theory of interpretation. We interpret, say, a clause in the Constitution correctly when we acquit the responsibility we rightly identify as the role of the interpreter, for example, a judge or a justice. The interpretation is therefore interpretive of the tradition in which it interprets. It's interpretive, as we might say, all the way down. We are therefore wrong to suppose, as we do in some moods but not others, that there's no right answer. We must explain the scope and the intractability of the disagreements we have and our judges have about what the law is. But we can't explain it through the incoherence of interpretive skepticism. We must explain it in the way I tried to do, that is, by pointing to the very elaborate substructure of any interpretive approach, hidden typically from the interpreter, but so dense and so ramified into 1,000 other values that the opportunity, if we might put it that way, for disagreement is endless. The attempt to recapture the nodal points of that disagreement, I think, is a great project for legal philosophy and legal history. We must avoid, therefore, at all times, the slander of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, in which some senators suppose that the law is easily discerned and that anyone who doesn't vote, any justice who doesn't vote as the senator wishes, is making the law up, imposing his own preferences. That is a slander. Justices are trying not to make up the law, but to find the law. They disagree about what it is, but I believe we can explain why they disagree in a way that doesn't rely on the incoherent, no right answer thesis. There is, I think, some practical bite in this exercise. Many academic lawyers and some judges take a kind of comfort from the no right answer form of skepticism. The teacher in his classroom says, to the delight of the law students, there's much to be said on both sides of this issue. There is no right answer. The judge sometimes feels, I believe, that when he has reached the point at which he has no more arguments that will convince, he's reached the end of his responsibility to examine. And that, I think, is a mistake he must acknowledge once he recognizes the theoretical foundation on which his instincts rest. Very few academic lawyers and even fewer judges have the time, inclination, or perhaps even capacity for political philosophy. But there must be room in every career for recognizing the structure of opinion I've described, and from time to time, in a cool moment, from examining critically that ice mass that lies beneath intuition. We must not make the opposite mistake, a mistake that fuels what I called the Judiciary Committee slander. And that is the mistake of thinking that in the end there's an algorithm, that law is really a science, that experts can pursue and find the right answer. Christopher Columbus Langdell built a temple to that mistaken idea in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we must recognize his idea as a mistake. Law is not literature but law is closer to poetry than it is to physics or even sacrilege economics. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.